Everyone thinks The Simpsons just cracks quick cartoon jokes about other shows for a laugh. A cutaway here, a parody there, nothing personal, nothing serious. One old writer's room, looking back at the same episodes, sees something else completely. In this video, we break down every show The Simpsons ever roasted. The rival animated sitcom, Family Guy. Two families lived on the same channel for years, both drawn in the same loose style, both built around a dumb dad, a smarter wife, and a house full of kids who caused trouble every week. One of those families had been on the air for a decade already. The other one showed up in 1999 wearing almost the same outfit. What followed was one of the strangest fights in television history, a fight that played out not through lawyers or press conferences, but through jokes hidden inside cartoons, aimed at cartoons, about cartoons. This is the story of how The Simpsons spent years quietly calling out Family Guy, and how that quiet feud eventually turned loud enough that a real news network had to step in. Family Guy debuted at the start of 1999 on Fox and pulled in numbers close to what The Simpsons was already getting. That timing mattered a lot. The Simpsons had spent 10 years building its reputation as the show that changed what a cartoon could talk about on television, and now there was a new show on the very same network wearing a lot of the same clothes. A dad with a normal job and no brains to speak of, a wife who was clearly the more capable one in the marriage, a teenage son causing chaos, a daughter stuck in the middle who nobody paid much attention to, and a baby who somehow never grew up no matter how many years passed. Fans noticed the resemblance almost right away, and so did the people actually working on The Simpsons. Family Guy leaned heavily on quick cutaway jokes, short scenes that jumped away from the main story just to land a laugh before jumping right back. This was different from how The Simpsons built its comedy, which usually stayed inside the main story and let jokes grow out of the plot itself. That difference in style became part of the tension too. Some people at The Simpsons felt Family Guy borrowed the bones of their show while skipping the work of building anything new around them. Over time, that feeling showed up on screen, tucked into background jokes that most casual viewers might miss completely, but that longtime fans of both shows caught right away. The two shows were not just neighbors on the same network schedule. They shared writers in a way. Some of the people who had worked on The Simpsons for years ended up connected to Family Guy projects down the line, and plenty of comedy writers moved between Fox's animated lineup as different shows launched and grew. That closeness only added more fuel to the sense of rivalry, since people inside the business could see exactly how similar the shows were built, right down to certain jokes and structures that seem to echo each other season after season. This piece of Simpsons history matters because it shows a side of the show that a lot of casual fans never think about, the side where Springfield turns its jokes outward at real competition instead of just poking fun at movies or made-up situations. Before this feud ever boiled over into something the news picked up, it started small, buried inside background gags that barely lasted a few seconds on screen. The first real shot came years before most viewers even noticed a pattern was forming. In the 2002 episode Treehouse of Horror XII, one segment showed a crowd of Homer clones filling the screen, and standing among them was Peter Griffin himself, drawn in as one of the duplicates. On its own, that single moment barely registered as anything more than a quick visual joke, the kind of background gag The Simpsons had used for years to reward sharp-eyed viewers. But looking back at it later, once the feud had grown into something much bigger, that Treehouse of Horror clone became the opening move. Placing Peter Griffin inside a crowd of Homer copies quietly suggested that Family Guy's lead character was, at his core, just another version of Homer Simpson wearing a different shirt. The joke stayed small for a few more years, but it never really went away. Writers on The Simpsons kept circling back to the same idea, the notion that Family Guy had lifted its entire setup from Springfield without doing much to make it its own. That idea eventually turned into something sharper and much easier for viewers to catch. In the 2005 episode The Italian Bob, two Italian police officers were shown flipping through a book of wanted criminals from America. One of the pages they landed on showed a photo of Peter Griffin with the word plagiarismo listed underneath his picture, the Italian word for plagiarism. This was no longer a quiet background clone hidden in a crowd. This was Peter Griffin's face directly labeled as a copycat, printed right next to the Italian translation of the exact crime The Simpsons writers felt Family Guy had committed against them. The joke worked because because it lined up so cleanly with what fans already believed that Family Guy had essentially copied the basic formula of The Simpsons, right down to the family structure, the working-class dad, and the chaotic household around him. It was a sharp jab, delivered fast and then gone, exactly the kind of joke The Simpsons had always been good at slipping past casual viewers while rewarding the ones paying close attention. What made this moment different from the earlier Treehouse of Horror clone was how personal it felt. A crowd of Homer lookalikes could be read as a general joke about how many shows had tried copying The Simpsons format over the years, since plenty of cartoons besides Family Guy had tried something similar. But putting Peter Griffin's face specifically next to the word plagiarism left almost no room for a different reading. This was The Simpsons picking out one show by name through image alone and accusing it directly. At this point, the feud had built into something with real weight behind it, even if most ordinary viewers were still unaware anything was happening at all. Two of the biggest cartoons on television, sharing a network, sharing a general audience, and sharing writers across the years, had reached a point where one show had twice pointed a finger at the other. The stage was set for something to finally boil over into the open, and it did not take long before Family Guy answered back in a way nobody could ignore. The turning point came in September 2007 in a Family Guy episode called Movin' Out, Brian's Song. Inside that episode, a scene showed the Simpson family being assaulted and violently killed, all packed into a short and shocking sequence aimed directly back at Springfield. This was Family Guy's answer to years of quiet digs, and it came in a form far more brutal than anything The Simpsons had thrown its way. Where The Simpsons had used a background clone and a single label under a mugshot, Family Guy chose to depict actual harm to an entire cartoon family that had been on the air for close to 2 decades. Seth MacFarlane, the man behind Family Guy, viewed this scene as just as personal as the plagiarism joke from 2 years earlier, and he did not see why Fox should treat the two situations differently. He argued that the network had let The Simpsons take its shots at Family Guy for years without stepping in, but the moment Family Guy hit back, executives suddenly wanted to shut the whole thing down. According to commentary connected to that same episode, Fox actually cut the extended version of the Simpson family scene before it aired. The network reportedly wanted to keep some form of ongoing back and forth between the two shows, but pulled back once the material crossed into territory involving real harm to beloved characters, rather than a quick visual joke or a single word under a photo. The full, uncut version of that scene reportedly still aired later on other networks like Adult Swim and TBS, and appeared on home video releases, even though the original Fox broadcast trimmed it down. This moment marked the clear high point of the entire feud. What started as a scattered joke about a cloned character in a Halloween special and grew into a sharper single frame accusing Peter Griffin of theft had now escalated into an entire scene built around violence against the other show's characters. Two shows that had spent years sharing a network, sharing writers, and sharing an audience had reached a point where one of them was willing to depict the total destruction of the other's cast just to settle a score over stolen jokes. The scale of that response changed everything about how people inside both shows approached the rivalry going forward. A background joke about a clone was easy to laugh off. A label under a mugshot was sharp but still played for comedy. A scene depicting the death of an entire beloved television family was something else entirely, and it forced everyone involved to think seriously about where the joke had gone and whether it should keep going any further in that direction. Once that scene aired, the fallout arrived quickly and reshaped how the two shows treated each other from that point forward. From that moment on, references to The Simpsons inside Family Guy took on a noticeably more respectful tone compared to before. In one later season, a jury made up of Simpsons characters was shown sentencing Peter Griffin to prison, a lighter and far less violent way of connecting the two shows. In another episode from around the same period, a drunken Peter Griffin openly admitted that his own show had stolen quite a lot of material from The Simpsons over the years. That admission stood in sharp contrast to the earlier violent retaliation scene, showing a shift toward Family Guy poking fun at itself rather than striking back at Springfield with anything close to that level of harshness again. The freeze between the two shows held for years. Executives at Fox reportedly grew cautious about letting either show take take direct shots at the other after the backlash connected to the 2007 episode, and that caution shaped the tone of both shows whenever the subject of the other came up on screen. Longtime Simpsons producers and writers, including people like Matt Groening himself, Al Jean, David X. Cohen, Matt Selman, Tim Long, and Joel H. Cohen, continued making comments about Family Guy in interviews and behind-the-scenes commentary, even as the on-screen jokes cooled off. These comments kept the old tension alive in a quieter form, mostly shared with fans through DVD extras and public interviews, rather than through new jokes hidden inside fresh episodes. Years later, former Simpsons showrunner Mike Reiss pointed out something specific during an appearance on a podcast hosted by longtime Simpsons voice actor Nancy Cartwright. Reiss explained that the opening credits sequence used by Family Guy closely resembled a joke first used inside a Simpsons episode called Lisa's First Word, where the family's usual short couch gag suddenly expanded into a full-stage production, complete with curtains opening, dancers and performers filling the screen. Reiss noted that Family Guy's own opening sequence ends with a strikingly similar image, curtains parting behind the characters as if introducing a big stage show. This comment showed that even decades after the initial feud had cooled down on screen, the people who built The Simpsons still remembered exactly which jokes they felt had been borrowed, and were happy to point them out whenever the chance came up. What makes this stretch of the story stand out is how differently the two shows chose to respond once things had calmed down. The Simpsons kept its jabs light and specific, tied to individual jokes or specific visual gags that could be pointed to directly. Family Guy, after its one major explosion of violence back in 2007, mostly backed away from matching that intensity again, choosing instead to have its own characters admit to borrowing material rather than striking back with more aggression. That difference in approach shaped how the rest of the rivalry played out over the following years, right up until the two shows finally decided to share a screen together for real. After years of trading jabs from a distance, the two families finally ended up in the same room. The idea for an actual crossover between the two shows first came up while the 13th season of Family Guy was being planned. Family Guy executive producer Richard Appel brought the idea to series creator Seth MacFarlane, who approved it, and Appel then reached out to Simpsons executive producers Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean for permission to use their characters. That permission was granted, helped along by the fact that Appel had previously spent 4 seasons working as a writer and producer on The Simpsons himself, which meant his former colleagues already trusted him with their characters. The crossover episode, called The Simpsons Guy, aired on September 28, 2014, and followed the Griffin family fleeing their hometown after Peter published an offensive comic strip in a local newspaper. Their car ends up stolen along the way, leaving them stranded, and eventually wandering into the town of Springfield, where they cross paths with the Simpson family for the first time. Inside the episode, Homer and Peter Griffin get into an argument over whose beer tastes better, which leads to a courtroom scene once it comes out that Family Guy's fictional beer brand was built as a direct knockoff of Duff, the beer brand from The Simpsons. The crossover packed in a long list of side-by-side character meetings, including a courtroom scene filled with matching characters sitting next to their counterparts from the other show, and a moment where the James Woods character from Family Guy meets the version of James Woods that had appeared in earlier Simpsons episodes. The crossover did not land smoothly with everyone watching. Ahead of the episode's release, Fox faced public pressure over a joke included in the promotional trailer, where Bart teaches Stewie how to make a prank phone call, and Stewie responds by making his own prank call with a line referencing sexual violence against someone's sister. Tim Winter, president of the advocacy group Parents Television Council, said he reached out directly to Fox, to Seth MacFarlane, and to Matt Groening, asking for the joke to be removed, but received no response from any of them. MacFarlane addressed the criticism directly in an interview, arguing that the joke worked fine once viewers saw it inside the full context of the episode. Looking back at that same joke years later, some critics pointed out that The Simpsons itself had leaned on a similarly harsh joke involving sexual violence in a season 14 episode called The Strong Arms of Ma, which is often ranked among the weakest episodes the show ever produced, specifically because of that content. That comparison mattered because it showed both shows had, at different points, been willing to use similar kinds of shock humor, even if fans tended to associate that particular style more closely with Family Guy Guy than with The Simpsons. By the time the crossover actually aired, general reaction across both fan bases landed somewhere in the middle, without much lasting excitement from either side. Some critics framed the whole event as coming 8 years after Family Guy's harshest strike against The Simpsons back in 2007, suggesting that by 2014 the original feud had cooled into something closer to old news, rather than a fresh rivalry worth reigniting. Despite the mixed reaction, the crossover marked a real turning point in how both shows treated each other going forward. In the years after The Simpsons Guy aired, Groening and MacFarlane appeared together in a joint interview with Entertainment Weekly, discussing their show's shared history in a far friendlier tone than anything seen during the years of the feud. Later references between the two shows shifted toward playful nods rather than sharp attacks, treating the years of jabs as a shared piece of television history both sides could look back on with a laugh rather than resentment. What this whole stretch of history left behind was a strange kind of respect, built entirely out of years of conflict. Two shows that spent close to a decade trading quiet insults through background jokes, mugshots, and one especially brutal retaliation scene eventually found their way to a shared episode, proving that even the sharpest television rivalries can end up sharing the same screen once enough time has passed. The feud never fully disappeared from memory, but it stopped being a fight and started being something closer to family history between two shows that had spent their entire lives standing next to each other on the same network schedule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That history with Family Guy shows one side of how Springfield handles a rival built in its own image, using barely noticeable jokes stretched across years rather than one single loud attack. A very different kind of target waits just ahead, one built entirely out of blood, cartoon violence, and a mouse who never learns to stop swinging the hammer. What that target says about the shows Bart grew up watching runs even deeper than anyone expects. Section 2. The violent cartoon genre. Itchy and Scratchy versus Tom and Jerry, Herman and Catnip, and Disney A Cat and a Mouse have been beating each other up on American television for longer than most of the adults watching The Simpsons have been alive. Long before Bart Simpson ever flipped on his television set, one duo had already spent decades chasing, smashing, and blowing each other up for laughs. The Simpsons took that history and turned it into its own weapon, building a cartoon within a cartoon so bloody and so over the top that it worked as a joke about every violent cartoon that came before it. This is the story of Itchy and Scratchy and the long line of real cartoons standing behind them. Bart Simpson loves exactly one show above all others, a program called The Itchy and Scratchy Show, which he watches on Channel 6 whenever he gets the chance. On screen, an orange mouse named Itchy spends every single episode finding brand new ways to destroy a black cat named Scratchy, using knives, explosives, chainsaws, and anything else within reach. Scratchy almost never fights back, and he almost never survives a single episode without losing several limbs or his entire body. Scratchy is a threadbare, dim-witted black cat who spends nearly every episode as the victim of Itchy's violent attacks. And unlike Tom from the real cartoon Tom and Jerry, Scratchy almost never does anything to provoke Itchy in the first place. The joke sits right there in that difference. A famous cartoon fight from real television history got copied, then pushed past any line a real cartoon studio would have ever crossed. Also, the writers behind The Simpsons could point straight at that kind of cartoon violence and ask why anyone found it normal in the first place. Itchy and Scratchy did not start out as something built for The Simpsons at all. The characters first showed up in a short segment called The Bart Simpson Show, which aired as part of The Tracy Ullman Show in 1988, a year before The Simpsons even had its own program. Back then, Itchy and Scratchy were drawn much smaller and closer to the size of an actual cat and mouse, and while the two were already shown fighting, the violence stayed fairly ordinary for a cartoon of that era. Once The Simpsons launched as its own show, Itchy and Scratchy grew into something far more extreme, both in how they looked and in how far the violence would go. The names Itchy and Scratchy came from Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, who took inspiration from two mice named Pixie and Dixie, characters who appeared in an older cartoon. But the inspiration for the violence itself reached back much further than that. As a kid, Groening and his friends used to imagine what an extremely violent cartoon might look like, and how much fun it might be to actually work on something built entirely around that idea. That childhood daydream eventually became one of the most recognizable running jokes in the history of American television. To understand why Itchy and Scratchy landed the way it did, it helps to know exactly which cartoons The Simpsons was aiming at. The most obvious target was a pair of characters characters most people already knew by heart, a cat and a mouse, who had been smashing into each other on television screens since long before The Simpsons ever existed. Tom and Jerry first appeared in American movie theaters in 1940, created by two animators named William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, working for a studio called MGM. Over the years that followed, Tom the Cat and Jerry the Mouse starred together in well over 100 short cartoons, and their adventures won 7 separate Academy Awards, a level of praise almost no other cartoon duo from that era ever came close to matching. Tom and Jerry cartoons were known for being genuinely rough, often showing new and inventive ways for one character to hurt the other, and unlike some other classic cartoon pairs from that same period, Tom and Jerry seemed to actually hate each other, eager to cause real pain whenever the chance came up. Millions of kids grew up watching Tom and Jerry reruns on Saturday mornings for decades after those original shorts stopped being made in theaters, which meant almost everyone tuning into The Simpsons already understood the basic shape of the joke the moment Itchy and Scratchy appeared on screen. Anyone who grew up on Tom and Jerry immediately recognized what Itchy and Scratchy was making fun of, since the setup felt so familiar: a cat and a mouse, constant fighting, cartoon violence played for laughs. The Simpsons simply pushed every part of that formula about 10 steps further than any real cartoon studio would have ever allowed, and that extra push is exactly where the joke lived. Tom and Jerry was not the only real cartoon standing behind Itchy and Scratchy, though it was easily the most famous one. According to longtime Simpsons producer David Silverman, Matt Groening actually built Itchy and Scratchy off a different and much less famous cartoon pair called Herman and Catnip, a duo that many people considered an even more violent version of Tom and Jerry. Simpsons writer and producer Mike Reiss agreed with that idea, describing Herman and Catnip as a cheap knockoff of Tom and Jerry that leaned even harder into extreme violence than the original ever did. Herman and Catnip never reached anywhere near the fame that Tom and Jerry did, but inside the world of old cartoon violence, the show carried a reputation for going further than almost anyone else dared to go at the time. Silverman went on to describe Herman and Catnip as funny, specifically because the cartoon itself was simply bad, made with less care and more shock value than the far more polished Tom and Jerry shorts. That distinction mattered a lot to the people building Itchy and Scratchy. The joke was never just about copying a famous cartoon fight. It was about copying the cheapest, roughest, least careful version of that fight, the kind of cartoon violence made purely to shock rather than to entertain, with any real craft behind it. Beyond Tom and Jerry and Herman and Catnip, the Itchy and Scratchy characters also drew from other classic cat and mouse cartoons, including a pair of characters named Pixie and Dixie, who appeared alongside a cat named Mr. Jinx. Some people who studied the history of the characters also pointed to an Italian comic strip called Squeak the Mouse, created by an artist named Massimo Mattioli, as another strong influence on Itchy and Scratchy, since that comic combined dark humor with graphic violence and sexual content aimed at a much more grown-up audience than a typical newspaper comic strip. None of these older properties reached the level of fame that Tom and Jerry carried, but each one added another layer to the joke, showing that violent cat and mouse cartoons had been a running trend across decades of animation, stretching well beyond just one famous studio or one famous pair of characters. With all of these older cartoons sitting in the background, the writers behind The Simpsons had a wide pool of real material to pull jokes from, and they built Itchy and Scratchy specifically to sit at the extreme end of that entire pool, past even the roughest cartoons that had actually aired on real television. Once Itchy and Scratchy became a regular part of The Simpsons, the writers quickly found a clear way to use the segments beyond just being a funny cartoon within a cartoon. Rather than treating Itchy and Scratchy purely as background filler, they started tying each short cartoon to whatever theme the surrounding episode happened to focus on, turning the segment into a flexible tool that could comment on almost anything happening in the main story. One later Itchy and Scratchy short called Dipod Sleigh List showed Scratchy listening to a device called a MyPod while Itchy cranked the volume up so high that Scratchy's eyes exploded, a joke tied directly to a storyline in that same Simpsons episode about Lisa owning a real MyPod. This kind of tie-in became something the writers leaned on again and again, using Itchy and Scratchy as a quick way to poke fun at whatever topic the main episode was already exploring, whether that meant new gadgets, popular trends, or other pieces of pop culture floating around at the time. The Simpsons producers responsible for these segments, Matt Selman and David Silverman, later explained in an interview that while Groening had mostly built Itchy and Scratchy around parodying Herman and Catnip, Selman and Silverman wanted to push the segment even further, turning it into into a tool the animators themselves could use to make jokes about their own industry. This meant Itchy and Scratchy stopped being purely about mocking old violent cartoons and started becoming a way for the people actually working on The Simpsons to comment on animation itself, on Hollywood, and eventually even on The Simpsons as a show. Executive producers Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein revealed on a commentary track that they specifically tried to include at least one episode built around Itchy and Scratchy in every single season they worked on, treating the segment as a reliable well the writers could return to whenever they needed a strong episode centered on cartoon culture. That commitment shows just how central Itchy and Scratchy had become to the show's identity, moving well past a simple one-time joke and turning into a full running feature the writers relied on year after year. The rising tension in this story is not built around one single dramatic scene, the way a typical Simpsons plot might build toward a big reveal. Instead, the tension here comes from just how far the writers kept pushing the violence and the targets behind it, testing exactly how much further a cartoon within a cartoon could go before it stopped being funny and started becoming something else entirely. Part of that pushing meant aiming Itchy and Scratchy at targets even bigger than Tom and Jerry. Walt Disney Pictures became one of the biggest names taken on directly through Itchy and Scratchy, since Disney had long been seen by rival animators as an easy target thanks to its massive dominance over the animation industry and its reputation for clean, family-friendly content. Specific Itchy and Scratchy shorts lean directly into Disney classics, including one called Steamboat Itchy, built as a direct spoof of Steamboat Willie, the very first cartoon to ever feature Mickey Mouse. Other shorts followed the same pattern, including one called Paniccio, a bloody parody of the Disney movie Pinocchio, and another called Scratchtasia, which took the artistic, musical Disney film Fantasia and turned it into something far more gruesome. These Disney-focused shorts pushed Itchy and Scratchy well past simply mocking old cat and mouse violence. Now the segment was taking direct aim at one of the most respected and successful names in the entire history of animation, using its most beloved and recognizable movies as raw material for cartoon gore. That kind of target choice raised the stakes considerably, since Disney carried a reputation built on decades of family-friendly storytelling, which made the contrast with Itchy and Scratchy's extreme violence land even harder as a joke. The mockery of Disney did not stop at parodying specific movies. The Simpsons went even further by building a fictional history for Itchy and Scratchy's own creator, a character named Roger Myers, and portraying him as a dishonest figure who stole his most famous idea from someone else entirely. This backstory gave the writers a way to take a direct shot at Walt Disney himself, using a fictional stand-in character to raise real questions about how animation studios built their fortunes and their famous characters. The show revealed that a character named Chester J. Lampwick had originally invented Itchy back in 1919, earning himself the nickname the father of cartoon violence within the world of the show. Roger Myers Sr., born in 1899 and shown living until 1979, later copied Lampwick's character and used it to build his own studio, called Itchy and Scratchy Studios, founded in 1921. This entire backstory was revealed in detail during a Season 7 episode. The joke worked on two levels at once. On the surface, it explained where the show's own cartoon within a cartoon supposedly came from. Underneath that surface, it doubled as a pointed jab at how much credit real early animation pioneers often failed to receive compared to the studio heads who built massive empires around characters they did not originally create themselves. The high moment of this entire piece of Simpsons history did not come from one single dramatic scene inside an episode. Instead, it came from a moment where the show turned Itchy and Scratchy inward, using the cartoon within a cartoon to make fun of The Simpsons itself, proving that no target, not even the show doing the joking, was completely safe from the same treatment. In an episode called The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show, the fictional studio behind Itchy and Scratchy introduces a brand new character named Poochie, meant to boost ratings and bring in a younger audience. Poochie turns out to be loud, obnoxious, and almost universally disliked by the audience watching within the show itself, a direct parody of how real television networks often try to save struggling shows by adding flashy new characters that longtime fans immediately reject. This episode worked as one of the sharpest and most self-aware jokes The Simpsons ever told through Itchy and Scratchy, since it used the segment to poke fun at network executives, forced character additions, and the entire process of trying to manufacture excitement around a long-running show through shortcuts rather than genuine creative choices. This moment mattered because it showed exactly how flexible Itchy and Scratchy had become as a tool. What started as a direct parody of Tom and Jerry, Herman and Catnip, and Disney eventually grew into something that could turn around and point straight back at The Simpsons itself, criticizing the same kinds of creative decisions that any long-running television show might eventually face. Few shows are willing to make fun of themselves using their own fictional cartoon within a cartoon, and that willingness became one of the clearest signs of just how sharp and self-aware The Simpsons could be at its best. The fallout from building such an extreme, exaggerated cartoon within the show reached beyond just entertaining audiences. It also stirred real conversation among fans and critics about cartoon violence in general, and about how far a show could push a joke about that violence before crossing into something uncomfortable rather than funny. One Simpsons producer noted that part of what made Itchy and Scratchy work as a joke came from the complete lack of any quick recovery, the kind normally seen in classic cartoon violence, where a character gets flattened by a piano and simply pops back up seconds later with no lasting damage. Itchy and Scratchy skipped that quick recovery almost entirely, showing damage that felt far more permanent and far more graphic than a typical cartoon would ever dare include. That same producer explained that this created an ironic kind of commentary on cartoon violence as a whole, since removing the usual quick recovery took the joke to a much more realistic level, forcing viewers watching the kids inside the show laugh at Itchy and Scratchy to notice their own laughter at just how excessive the violence had become. This layered joke, laughing at characters laughing at violence, became one of the most talked about parts of the entire segment among critics who studied the show closely. It gave The Simpsons a way to comment on real cartoon violence without ever needing to lecture its audience directly, letting the joke itself carry the entire point. Behind the scenes, the writers occasionally allowed themselves a bit more creative freedom than a typical Itchy and Scratchy short usually received, including one specific episode called Butter Off Dead, where part of the segment was reportedly improvised rather than tightly scripted like most Itchy and Scratchy content. This detail matters because it shows that even inside a segment built almost entirely around exaggerated violence, the show occasionally left room for spontaneous creative choices, treating Itchy and Scratchy as more than just a rigid formula repeated the same way every single time it appeared. The influence of Itchy and Scratchy grew large enough that when The Simpsons finally made its own full-length movie, the filmmakers built an entire opening sequence around the segment, styled as a parody of the famous science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and this particular short became the longest single Itchy and Scratchy segment ever produced for the franchise. According to producer Al Jean, one specific joke inside that movie opening, involving explosives filling Scratchy's mouth, came together very late in the production process. Added only after test screenings in cities like Portland and Arizona showed the joke was not landing the way the writers originally hoped. Once the joke finally got the laugh the team was looking for, it stayed in the finished film. That same movie sequence also included a parody aimed at the film Reservoir Dogs, and Al Jean revealed that the production team actually reached out to offer director Quentin Tarantino a chance to voice a version of himself inside that specific parody, an offer Tarantino ultimately turned down. This detail shows just how far Itchy and Scratchy had traveled from its original roots parodying old cat and mouse cartoons. By the time of the Simpsons movie, the segment had grown into something big enough and well known enough that a real famous filmmaker was invited to take part in one of its jokes directly. What Itchy and Scratchy left behind reaches far beyond just being a funny running joke inside The Simpsons. The segment became one of the clearest examples in television history of a show using an exaggerated parody to comment on real trends across an entire industry, rather than aiming at just one single target. Tom and Jerry gave Itchy and Scratchy its most obvious shape, the basic cat and mouse setup that almost every viewer instantly recognized. Herman and Catnip gave the segment its rougher, cheaper edge, the sense that some old cartoons went even further into shock value than most people remembered. Disney gave Itchy and Scratchy its biggest and most respected target, turning beloved family classics into raw material for gore-based jokes that highlighted just how carefully Disney usually protected its own image. And the show's own fictional backstory for Roger Myers and Chester Lampwick gave the whole segment a way to comment on how animation studios built their fortunes, often standing on the uncredited work of earlier creators. Taken together, these layers turned Itchy and Scratchy into far more than a simple parody of one violent cartoon cartoon duo, it became a running argument about the entire history of cartoon violence, stretched across decades of animation, wrapped inside a segment so extreme that it forced viewers to notice exactly what they had been laughing at all along, whether they were watching Tom and Jerry as kids or watching Itchy and Scratchy decades later as fans of The Simpsons. Bart Simpson never once stops loving his favorite bloody cartoon, and the show never stops using it to poke fun at everything from old Hollywood studios to modern gadgets. That kind of long-running, layered joke says a lot about how carefully The Simpsons studied the shows that came before it, using an entire genre of cartoon violence as raw material for its own brand of comedy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield does not save its sharpest jokes only for cartoons, though. Somewhere across town, Chief Wiggum and his officers are about to get their own turn under the microscope, chasing criminals in front of cameras in a way that feels a little too familiar to anyone who has ever flipped past a certain kind of reality show late at night. Section 3. The Reality Cop Show. Cops' real police work rarely looks the way it does on television, and one long-running program built its entire reputation on filming officers as they chase down criminals in real time, with shaky cameras and blurred faces standing in for actual police work. The Simpsons noticed that formula early on and built its own version, filling it with officers who could barely catch a criminal even with a camera crew following their every move. This is the story of how Springfield turned real police reality television into one of its sharpest running jokes, using its own hopeless police force to make the entire genre look ridiculous. The Simpsons introduced a fictional show called Cops in Springfield inside the Season 4 episode Homer's Triple Bypass, and the entire segment was built as a direct parody of a real television program simply called Cops. That real show first aired on the Fox network on March 11, 1989. Cops followed actual police officers on actual patrols, filming real arrests, real chases, and real conversations between officers and the people they pulled over or brought in. The show eventually left Fox years later, and other networks picked it up over time. Spike, which later became known as Paramount Network, started airing Cops again in 2013, and by 2021, the program had moved once more, this time landing on Fox Nation. Through all of those moves, the basic format stayed exactly the same: real footage of real police officers doing real police work, shown to a national audience as unscripted entertainment. The Simpsons built its parody, Cops in Springfield, around the exact same structure as the real show, following Chief Wiggum and his officers as they attempted actual police work while cameras rolled. The joke came from just how badly that police work went every single time. Before looking closely at what happens inside the parody itself, it helps to understand why Chief Wiggum and his department made such an easy target in the first place. Long before Cops in Springfield ever aired, The Simpsons had already built a reputation for showing the Springfield Police Department as lazy, careless, and often barely competent at the most basic parts of the job. That reputation set the stage perfectly for a segment built around filming the department in action, since audiences already expected very little from Wiggum and his officers whenever they picked up a badge and a gun. Springfield's police force earned that reputation across dozens of episodes stretched over many years. In one episode, Otto the bus driver drove an entire school bus straight through a police department picnic, running over the food laid out for the officers, and Chief Wiggum's only real concern afterward involved figuring out who had grabbed his sandwich. In another episode, two officers named Eddie and Lou arrested a real professional baseball player named Steve Sachs purely because he happened to be from New York City, treating that detail alone as enough evidence to justify hauling him in. When Sachs asked for a lawyer, the officers waved him off, telling him he watched too much television. In yet another storyline, Marge Simpson herself joined the police force for a while, only to quit once she saw firsthand just how little the other officers seemed to care about actually stopping crime, letting obvious wrongdoing slide again and again without consequence. All of this earlier material gave The Simpsons a perfect foundation to build directly on once the writers decided to create their own version of Cops. Real television audiences already loved watching real police officers chase down real criminals on camera. Springfield audiences, and audiences watching The Simpsons at home, already knew that Chief Wiggum's department could barely manage basic police work even without a camera crew following them everywhere they went. Combining those two ideas practically wrote the joke on its own. Inside Homer's Triple Bypass, Cops in Springfield opens with its own theme song, a track called Bad Cops, built specifically as a parody of a real song called Bad Boys by a group named Inner Circle. That real song served as the actual theme music for Cops for years, playing at the start of nearly every single episode, with an instrumental version often closing out the show at the end. Bad Cops copied that same structure inside The Simpsons, playing a similar tune whenever the Springfield police appeared on screen throughout the segment, instantly signaling to viewers exactly which real show was being made fun of before a single joke even landed. The segment itself was reportedly created partly out of simple necessity rather than being planned from the very start as a major part of the episode. According to details connected to the episode, Cops in Springfield was largely built to fill extra time, since the main story inside Homer's triple bypass ran shorter than a full episode needed to be on its own. Rather than stretching the main plot artificially, the writers built an entire side segment parodying a real, popular television show, turning a scheduling problem into one of the most memorable side stories in the episode. Once the cameras start rolling inside the fictional Cops in Springfield, the officers immediately begin failing at nearly everything they attempt, one small disaster after another. Chief Wiggum tries to talk a man down from a ledge after the man appears ready to jump, but rather than successfully talking him down, the man simply chooses to drop anyway, showing just how little control or influence Wiggum actually holds in a moment that should call for real skill and careful handling. Right afterward, officers show a cop chasing down and tackling a criminal, only for it to turn out that this chase itself is just another clip from a television show that Wiggum and his men happen to be watching on a screen inside the real segment, blurring the line between real police footage and the fictional shows the officers themselves enjoy watching during downtime. The chaos continues from there. Officers Eddie and Lou search through the beard of a character named Jasper and somehow manage to pull out an actual gun, a pair of brass knuckles, and a hand grenade, all hidden inside the man's facial hair, treating an obviously absurd search as if it were standard procedure. Later in the same segment, the officers encounter a mummy and respond by opening fire, with Chief Wiggum eventually just throwing his own gun directly at the mummy rather than using it properly, showing once again that basic weapon handling seems to be a skill nobody on the force has fully mastered. A police helicopter appears at another point during the segment, supposedly out on patrol above the town, but it turns out the helicopter is simply hovering over a local drive-in movie theater instead of doing any actual surveillance work. Rather than searching for criminals or watching over the town, the helicopter crew appears to just be using police resources to catch a free movie from above, a small detail that speaks volumes about how seriously the department treats its actual responsibilities. Perhaps the sharpest joke inside the entire segment involves Reverend Lovejoy. The police storm his house, breaking down his door because they believe he is responsible for stealing cattle in the area. The real culprit, a recurring troublemaker named Snake, happens to live right next door the entire time and simply drives off while the officers are busy tearing apart the Reverend's home based on nothing more than a mistaken assumption. This single moment captures the entire spirit of Cops in Springfield perfectly. Officers chasing down the wrong person entirely while the actual criminal escapes without any real effort at all. The episode also reveals, almost as a side detail buried inside all of this chaos, that Snake lives at the address 742 Evergreen Terrace, the very same address that would later become permanently established as the Simpson family's own home throughout the rest of the show's run. This small detail connects the Cops in Springfield segment directly into the larger world of the show, tying a throwaway joke about a mistaken cattle rustling arrest into a piece of information that fans would recognize and reference for years afterward. Taken together, every single moment inside Cops in Springfield builds toward the same basic point. Real police reality shows like Cops presented themselves as exciting, dramatic looks at real law enforcement doing real work under pressure. Springfield's version stripped away all of that drama and replaced it with pure incompetence, showing officers who could barely manage the simplest tasks, even with cameras capturing their every move. The joke worked precisely because it never needed to exaggerate the format of the real show very much at all. The Simpsons simply kept the exact same structure real audiences already recognized from Cops, and filled that structure with officers already established across years of earlier episodes as lazy, careless, and easily distracted. Cops in Springfield was not the only moment where The Simpsons directly referenced the real show. In a later episode called The Springfield Connection, which aired as the season 6 finale, Marge Simpson decides to join the police force after helping stop a criminal on her own. Inside that same episode, a domestic disturbance between Principal Skinner and his own mother gets shown as an actual episode of Cops airing on television, complete with Skinner's face blurred out, exactly the way real people appearing on The Real Cops often had their faces obscured for legal reasons whenever they had not agreed to appear on camera. This additional reference shows that The Simpsons returned to poking fun at cops more than once, treating the real show as a reliable target the writers could return to whenever a police-related storyline called for it. The choice to blur Skinner's face carries its own small layer of commentary buried inside the joke. Real television networks airing Cops often blurred faces specifically to avoid legal trouble, protecting themselves from people who had not given permission to be shown during clearly embarrassing or difficult moments in their lives. By copying that exact technique for a joke involving Principal Skinner and his mother, The Simpsons pointed out just how strange it looks when a television show claims to be protecting someone's privacy while still broadcasting one of the most embarrassing moments of that person's life to a national audience. Marge's entire storyline throughout the Springfield connection adds even more weight to the show's ongoing commentary on real police work. After joining the force with real enthusiasm, hoping to make a genuine difference, Marge quickly grows disappointed by just how little the other officers actually care about stopping real crime happening right in front of them. She eventually catches a character named Herman running an illegal business involving counterfeit clothing, only for Chief Wiggum to claim the evidence has mysteriously disappeared, allowing Herman to walk free despite Marge doing everything correctly by the book. It later becomes clear that the missing evidence disappeared because the other officers had simply taken it for themselves, wearing the counterfeit jeans right in front of Marge without any shame or concern about getting caught. This storyline works alongside Cops in Springfield to build a much larger picture of how The Simpsons viewed real police reality television as a whole. Shows like Cops presented themselves as honest, unscripted windows into real law enforcement, letting audiences feel like they were watching genuine justice happen in real time. The Simpsons consistently argued, through episode after episode, that this kind of honest and effective police work rarely matched what audiences actually saw once cameras started rolling in real departments, whether inside a fictional Springfield or in any real town watching officers chase down criminals for television ratings rather than genuine public safety. The choice to build an entire fake reality show around Chief Wiggum's department also reflects something specific about how popular real police reality television had become by the time this episode aired. Shows like Cops pulled in large audiences specifically because ordinary people found real police chases and real arrests genuinely entertaining to watch, regardless of whether that entertainment came at the expense of the actual people being filmed during difficult or embarrassing moments in their lives. By building Cops in Springfield around a department already established as incompetent, The Simpsons managed to poke fun at both the real show's format and at the idea that audiences should trust unscripted police footage as an accurate picture of real law enforcement in the first place. None of this commentary required any of the show's usual dramatic build-up or plot twists. Unlike a typical Simpsons storyline that moves through rising action towards some kind of climax, the joke inside Cops in Springfield worked through repetition, one small failure after another, stacking up across just a few short minutes of screen time. Officers missing obvious criminals, officers arresting the wrong people entirely, officers using police equipment for personal entertainment rather than actual patrol work. Each failure landed as its own quick joke, but together they built into a complete argument about how little real substance often hides behind exciting, fast-paced police reality programming. What Cops in Springfield left behind reaches beyond just a funny segment tucked inside one episode from season 4. It became one of the clearest examples of The Simpsons taking direct aim at an entire genre of unscripted television, using a format audiences already recognized from real life and filling it with characters the show had already spent years establishing as unreliable and incompetent. The joke required almost no exaggeration of the real show's structure, relying instead on audiences already knowing exactly how ridiculous Chief Wiggum's department could be, even without any cameras following their every move. The Springfield connection added another layer years later, returning to the same well by directly referencing cops again through the blurred face joke and by giving Marge a first-hand look at just how broken the department really was from the inside. Between these two episodes, The Simpsons built a lasting argument that real police reality television, no matter how exciting it looked on screen, often left out far more than it ever actually showed, and that the officers being filmed rarely deserved the heroic treatment those shows tended to give them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's cameras eventually pointed towards something even stranger than a police chase gone wrong. Somewhere out past the edge of town, in the dark woods where nobody expects anything unusual to happen, Homer Simpson is about to have an encounter that will bring two federal agents straight into Springfield, chasing a mystery that reaches far beyond anything Chief Wiggum's department could ever hope to solve on its own. Section 4. The Sci-Fi Conspiracy Drama, The X-Files. Two federal agents built an entire television career out of chasing shadows, aliens, and government secrets that always seemed to slip away right before the truth came out. That show became one of the biggest hits on its network during the 1990s, filled with fog, flashlights, and a running argument between a believer and a skeptic. The Simpsons eventually brought that exact show straight into Springfield and turned a serious ongoing mystery into one giant joke about drunk townsfolk, glowing nuclear waste, and a federal agent who still could not get a straight answer out of anyone. This is the story of how The Simpsons rolled out the red carpet for The X-Files, only to make fun of nearly everything that made the real show famous. The episode responsible for this crossover was called The Springfield Files, and it aired as the 10th episode of Season 8 on January 12, 1997. It was written by Reed Harrison and directed by Stephen Dean Moore. The story came from two former Simpsons showrunners named Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who returned to write this particular episode while they were working under contract for the Walt Disney Company at the time, stepping back into Springfield for one specific project rather than a full season. Their work on the episode later earned them an Annie Award, one of the most respected prizes given out for excellence in animation. The episode opens with a framing device narrated by Leonard Nimoy, the actor famous for playing Spock on Star Trek, appearing as himself and introducing a program about strange encounters and unexplained events. This setup alone was already a small joke aimed at the entire genre of mysterious encounter shows that had become popular around that time, shows that loved using a serious, dramatic host to introduce stories about aliens, ghosts, and government cover-ups. Nimoy's presence added a layer of credibility to the joke, since audiences already associated him closely with science fiction thanks to his decades of work on Star Trek. Inside that framing story, Homer Simpson decides to try something different one Friday night at Moe's Tavern rather than sticking with his usual drink order. He ends up trying a beverage called Boris Yeltsin, and after having far too much to drink, Homer finds himself walking home alone rather than driving, since even by his own low standards, he recognizes that driving home in his current condition would be a bad idea. While stumbling through the woods on his way back, Homer becomes convinced that he has seen an actual alien standing right in front of him. Nobody else in Springfield believes him. His own family and neighbors immediately assume Homer simply had another one of his usual drunken hallucinations, treating the entire story as nothing more than another embarrassing moment from a man already known around town for questionable decisions after a night of heavy drinking. This response set up the entire structure the rest of the episode would follow, closely copying the basic formula used by the X-Files itself. A strange, unexplained event followed immediately by skepticism from everyone except the person who witnessed it firsthand. To understand why this particular formula worked so well as a target for parody, it helps to know exactly what The X-Files looked like as a real television show. The X-Files followed two FBI agents, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, as they investigated cases the Bureau considered too strange or unexplainable for regular agents to handle. Mulder believed deeply in the possibility of aliens, government conspiracies, and paranormal activity, often pushing the investigation forward based on instinct and personal conviction. Scully, by contrast, approached every single case as a trained scientist first, looking for logical, medical, or otherwise rational explanations before accepting anything supernatural as the true answer. That constant tension between belief and skepticism became the heart of the real show, driving nearly every episode forward as the two agents worked through evidence from completely opposite starting points. The Simpsons built its own version of that exact tension directly into the Springfield files, but flipped the roles in a way that fit perfectly within the world of Springfield. Rather than showing two trained federal agents debating the truth, the show placed Homer in the role of the true believer, insisting he had seen something real out in the woods, no matter how much doubt everyone around him piled on top of his story. Lisa Simpson stepped into the skeptic role, a young girl already established across the series as someone deeply interested in science and logical thinking, going so far as to hold an actual subscription to a real magazine focused on skepticism and critical thinking. Watching an 8-year-old girl argue against her own father using careful, scientific reasoning gave the entire setup a comedic twist that the real X-Files never had room for, since the real show kept its skepticism and belief locked between two trained adult professionals working the same case together. Word of Homer's strange encounter eventually spreads far enough that it catches national attention, and this is exactly where the real crossover begins. Special agents Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, played by the actual actors from The X-Files, David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, travel to Springfield themselves in order to investigate what really happened to Homer out in those woods. This was not simply a Simpsons episode featuring actors doing guest voice work using new characters written specifically for the show. Duchovny and Anderson voiced their own established characters from The X-Files, bringing the exact same roles they played on their own network drama directly into an entirely different show built around comedy rather than serious investigation. Bringing real actors into Springfield to voice their own famous characters raised the stakes of the entire parody considerably. Rather than simply making jokes about The X-Files from a distance, The Simpsons managed to get the actual stars of that show to take part directly in poking fun at their own on-screen personas, adding a layer of self-awareness that made the whole crossover land even harder with audiences familiar with both shows. Once Mulder and Scully arrive in Springfield, the investigation begins in earnest, following many of the same beats real fans of The X-Files would immediately recognize from the actual show. Mulder approaches the case with total conviction that something genuinely unexplainable happened, while Scully treats the entire situation with careful, professional doubt, exactly matching the roles both characters played across the real program for years. This consistency mattered a great deal to how well the joke worked. The Simpsons did not need to exaggerate Mulder and Scully's personalities very much at all, since simply placing the two characters exactly as they normally behaved into the middle of Springfield's usual chaos created plenty of comedy entirely on its own. Small details throughout the investigation added extra layers of humor specifically aimed at longtime fans of The X-Files rather than casual viewers who had never watched the real show. At one point, Mulder's official FBI identification photo is shown, and rather than a standard, professional-looking badge picture, the image shows him sitting in a provocative pose while wearing a black swimsuit. This particular joke worked on two separate levels at once. It referenced an earlier role David Duchovny had played in a different, much steamier television program called Red Shoe Diaries, and it also poked fun at a specific episode of The X-Files itself, where Mulder was shown swimming laps in a pool during an unusually casual, physical moment for a character normally associated with dark rooms, secret files, and quiet paranoia rather than swimwear. Throughout the episode, Mulder repeatedly insists that the FBI has very little real interest in matters involving something as small as a single alien sighting in a random small town, claiming the Bureau focuses its attention on far bigger threats like international crime organizations instead. This line worked as a subtle joke about how seriously the real X-Files often treated its government conspiracy storylines, especially since fans of the actual show knew the Bureau within that fictional world frequently became deeply obsessed with exactly this kind of strange, small-scale mystery despite officially claiming otherwise. As the investigation continues, tension builds not through any dangerous government conspiracy or hidden alien threat, but through simple, everyday Springfield problems getting mixed directly into a story that would normally carry a much darker, more serious tone on the actual X-Files. Rather than shadowy government agents trying to silence witnesses or destroy evidence, the biggest obstacles facing Mulder and Scully during their investigation come from ordinary Springfield residents being distracted, confused, or simply unhelpful in mundane, everyday ways that had nothing to do with any real conspiracy at all. This mismatch between the seriousness of a typical X-Files investigation and the pure silliness of everyday Springfield life became one of the sharpest running jokes throughout the entire episode. Real fans of The X-Files were used to watching Mulder and Scully face genuine danger, government cover-ups, and terrifying unexplained phenomena during their investigations. Inside Springfield, the biggest obstacle turns out to be almost nothing dangerous at all, and the actual explanation behind Homer's alien sighting ends up being something entirely ordinary once everything finally comes together. The high point of the entire episode arrives once the true explanation behind Homer's alien sighting finally comes out. The glowing creature Homer spotted out in the woods turns out to be Mr. Burns, the elderly owner of the Springfield nuclear power plant, wandering outside while heavily medicated and glowing faintly in the dark because of decades spent working around radioactive material at his own plant. Rather than a genuine alien encounter or any kind of hidden government secret, the entire mystery boils down to an old man who happened to glow slightly due to years of exposure to nuclear material, stumbling through the woods in an unusual state. This resolution worked as a direct parody of exactly the kind of storyline The X-Files built its entire reputation around: government secrets, strange radiation, and mysterious figures appearing in the dark. But rather than uncovering anything genuinely sinister or otherworldly, The Simpsons revealed the entire mystery to be nothing more than an unfortunate side effect of poor workplace safety standards at a badly run nuclear facility, a target the show had already poked fun at for years through Mr. Burns and his plant. This ending gave the episode a way to combine two of its favorite ongoing jokes, mocking a real popular television drama while also reminding audiences just how careless and dangerous Mr. Burns had always run his own nuclear power plant throughout the entire series. Once the mystery gets solved, the fallout plays out in a way that keeps the tone light rather than dramatic, matching the overall comedic spirit of the episode rather than trying to wrap things up with any real seriousness. Mulder and Scully depart Springfield having solved the case, though the actual explanation turns out to be far less exciting than either agent likely expected when they first arrived, expecting a genuine alien encounter worth investigating. Reverend Lovejoy adds his own small piece of commentary during this stretch of the episode, delivering a sermon where he mentions another gentle visitor from the heavens, connecting Homer's supposed alien encounter to older, more familiar stories the town might already understand better than an actual extraterrestrial visitor. This detail added a small extra layer of humor by showing how quickly and easily Springfield residents tried folding a strange, unfamiliar event into something more comfortable and familiar rather than genuinely grappling with the idea of an actual close encounter happening in their own town. Throughout the episode, The Simpsons also took direct aim at its own network rather than staying focused purely on The X-Files itself. At one point, Bart and Homer break away from the main story entirely and turn directly toward the camera, mugging and reacting in an exaggerated way while promoting other shows airing on the Fox network. Since The X-Files aired on that exact same network as The Simpsons at the time, this moment worked as a joke, aimed squarely at Fox itself, poking fun at how networks constantly use their own biggest hit shows to promote everything else on their schedule, blending genuine storytelling with blatant advertising inside the same broadcast. This choice to mock Fox directly, rather than only mocking The X-Files as a separate show, mattered because it showed The Simpsons was willing to bite the exact hand feeding it, taking aim at its own network's business practices, even while benefiting from a major crossover event built specifically to drive viewers toward both shows at once. Rather than treating the crossover purely as free promotion for two hit programs sharing a home on Fox, the writers slipped in a joke that quietly criticized the entire practice of cross-promotion itself. The episode included several smaller references scattered throughout that added even more depth for attentive viewers already familiar with the world of The X-Files. The chalkboard gag opening the episode read, "The truth is not out there," a direct twist on the real show's famous tagline, which normally read, "The truth is out there," printed at the start of nearly every episode of the actual program. Flipping that phrase around gave viewers an immediate signal, right from the very first seconds of the episode, that this particular Simpsons story planned to turn the entire serious tone of The X-Files completely upside down. The couch gag opening the episode also tied directly into the science fiction theme running throughout the rest of the story, showing the Simpson family flying directly into their living room and landing on their couch using jetpacks strapped to their backs, rather than walking in through the front door the way they normally would at the start of nearly every other particular episode. This small visual joke helped set the tone immediately, signaling to viewers that this particular episode planned to lean heavily into science fiction imagery well beyond just the main alien storyline itself. What the Springfield Files left behind reaches well beyond just being a fun, one-time crossover event between two popular shows sharing the same network. The episode became widely remembered as one of the strongest examples of how a comedy show could successfully cross over with a completely different genre of television without losing what made either show work in the first place. Rather than forcing the X-Files characters into a story that felt awkward or out of place inside Springfield, the writers built an entire episode specifically designed around what already made both shows successful: careful investigation and genuine belief clashing against skepticism on one side, paired with Springfield's usual chaotic, self-inflicted problems on the other. The episode also demonstrated something important about how The Simpsons approached parody in general throughout its long history. Rather than mocking the X-Files by exaggerating it into something unrecognizable, the writers stayed remarkably close to how the real characters actually behaved, trusting that placing Mulder and Scully's genuine personalities directly into Springfield's absurd world would create plenty of natural comedy without needing heavy exaggeration. This approach reflected a much larger pattern found across nearly every parody The Simpsons ever built, respecting the source material enough to get the details right, while still finding sharp, specific angles to poke fun at along the way. By bringing in the real actors to voice their own established characters, rather than writing entirely new roles inspired loosely by the X-Files, The Simpsons pulled off something considerably harder than a typical parody episode. Getting Duchovny and Anderson to willingly poke fun at their own famous roles inside a comedy show airing on the very same network as their own serious drama required real cooperation and a good sense of humor from performers who might have easily turned down a much smaller, less prestigious project during the height of their show's own popularity. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's brush with a real federal mystery ends quietly enough once an old, glowing power plant owner turns out to be behind the whole thing. But federal agents are not the only outside forces about to show up in Springfield chasing down a serious threat under a tight deadline. Somewhere across town, inside the halls of Springfield Elementary School, an entirely different kind of emergency is about to unfold, one measured out in minutes rather than months, with a stink bomb ticking down toward disaster and an entire school counting on two kids working against the clock. Section 5. The Real-Time Action Thriller. 24. A ticking clock, a countdown running in real time, and a hero who somehow manages to stop the worst disasters imaginable within a single day. That combination turned one drama into one of the most talked about action shows on television during the 2000s. The Simpsons eventually pointed that entire format straight at a school bake sale, turning a stink bomb made from spoiled yogurt into the biggest threat Springfield Elementary had ever faced. This is the story of how The Simpsons shrank down an entire action-packed thriller into 24 minutes of school hallway chaos without losing a single beat of the format that made the real show famous. The episode responsible for this parody was called 24 Minutes, and it aired as the 21st episode of Season 18 on May 20th, 2007, as part of a one-hour season finale alongside another episode called You Can't Always Say What You Want. It was written by Ian Maxtone Graham and Billy Kimball, marking Kimball's very first writing credit on the show. The episode had originally been promoted as the 400th episode of The Simpsons, a major milestone worth celebrating, though it ended up actually airing as the 399th episode instead, with the honor of officially being episode 400 landing on the episode that aired right alongside it that same night. 24 Minutes worked as a direct spoof of the Fox television drama 24, and the title itself carried a clever double meaning built right into the wording. Beyond simply matching the name of the real show being parodied, the title also poked fun at a completely different program called 60 Minutes, a long-running news program known for its serious, in-depth reporting style. Squeezing both references into a single four-word title showed just how much thought went into even the smallest details of this particular parody before the actual story ever began. To understand why 24 worked so well as a target, it helps to know exactly what made the real show stand out from other action dramas on television at the time. Each season of 24 followed federal agent Jack Bauer across a single single day, with every episode representing roughly 1 hour of that day playing out in something close to real time. The show built tension through a ticking clock, displayed on screen throughout every episode, reminding viewers constantly just how little time remained before some looming disaster would strike if Bauer failed to stop it. Episodes frequently use split screens, showing several different characters and storylines happening at the exact same moment across different parts of the screen, letting viewers watch multiple threads of the same emergency unfold side by side rather than one scene at a time. 24 also built its drama around the idea of a special unit built specifically to handle emergencies, too urgent or too dangerous for regular authorities to manage properly. That unit worked under enormous time pressure, racing against a countdown that never stopped ticking down, no matter how the investigation was actually going at any given moment. The Simpsons built its own version of nearly every one of these exact elements directly into 24 minutes, translating each piece of the real show's format into something that fit perfectly inside the walls of Springfield Elementary School. Rather than a federal agent racing to stop a terrorist attack somewhere in a major city, the story followed Principal Skinner forming a new group called the Counter-Truancy Unit, built specifically to stop students from skipping school, with the entire unit eventually being led by Lisa Simpson once the actual emergency of the episode began unfolding. The name Counter-Truancy Unit itself worked as a direct parody of a real organization featured throughout 24 called the Counter-Terrorist Unit, often shortened simply to CTU by characters within that show. Matching that exact abbreviation style, right down to the same three-letter structure, showed how closely The Simpsons studied the real show before building its own parody version, making sure even small structural details lined up cleanly enough for fans of 24 to recognize the reference immediately. The actual emergency driving the plot of 24 Minutes involved a group of school bullies planning to release a powerful stink bomb during Springfield Elementary's annual bake sale. The stink bomb itself had an oddly specific origin tied directly into an earlier part of the episode, built using an old, badly spoiled container of yogurt that Homer had left sitting at the nuclear power plant for far too long. The yogurt had gone bad to such an extreme degree that even trained professionals working at a nuclear facility apparently had no safe way to properly dispose of it, treating the rotten food almost like hazardous waste in its own right. Jimbo and his friends eventually got their hands on this health hazard and decided to turn it into a stink bomb powerful enough to threaten ruining the entire bake sale and, by extension, the whole school event built around it. Turning a container of expired yogurt into the central thread of an entire episode built as an action-packed thriller parody captured exactly the kind of joke The Simpsons specialized in throughout its history. Real episodes of 24 usually built tension around nuclear bombs, deadly viruses, or other genuinely terrifying weapons capable of causing mass casualties across an entire city. Springfield's version of that same terrifying countdown revolved entirely around bad yogurt fumes threatening to ruin a school fundraiser, a threat that sounded almost as dangerous inside the fictional world of the episode as any real bomb, despite being something almost comically small and harmless once viewers stepped back and considered what was actually at stake. Once the threat becomes clear, Bart and Lisa join forces to try stopping the bullies before the stink bomb can go off during the bake sale. This teamwork between siblings who normally clash constantly throughout the rest of the series added its own layer of humor to the story, since 24 usually built its tension around trained government agents working together under enormous pressure, while Springfield's version simply handed that same level of urgency to two kids trying to stop a prank rather than an actual act of terrorism. The two siblings receive help along the way from several other students at the school, including Martin Prince, a character already well known throughout the series as intelligent, socially awkward, and eager to please authority figures whenever possible. Having Martin join the effort added another small joke aimed directly at 24, since the real show frequently relied on a wide network of skilled specialists, supporting the main hero from behind the scenes, providing technical help, tracking down leads, or offering expert advice during a crisis. Martin stepping into that same kind of supporting role, using his intelligence to help Bart and Lisa rather rather than any real government resources, match that structure closely while keeping the entire stakes appropriately small and silly for a story built around a school bake sale rather than a genuine international crisis. The real crossover element inside 24 Minutes came through guest appearances by two actual actors from 24 itself, Kiefer Sutherland and Mary Lynn Rajskub, both of whom voiced their own established characters from The Real Show, Jack Bauer and Chloe O'Brien. Exactly like the earlier crossover with The X-Files, this was not simply new voice work built around characters loosely inspired by 24. Sutherland and Rajskub stepped directly into their own famous roles, bringing their real characters into Springfield's world for this one specific episode. Jack Bauer's presence inside the episode gave the writers plenty of room to build jokes around the contrast between his usual high-stakes, life-or-death missions on The Real Show and the comparatively tiny stakes of a school bake sale threatened by expired yogurt fumes. At one point during the episode, Bart clashes directly with Jack Bauer, who happens to be dealing with an important mission of his own happening at the very same time inside Springfield, giving the episode a chance to physically bring together a serious action hero and a mischievous 10-year-old boy, letting both personalities collide in a way that highlighted just how mismatched their usual worlds actually were. The episode leaned heavily on visual techniques borrowed directly from The Real Show as well, rather than just borrowing character names and general plot ideas. Brief split-screen sequences appeared throughout 24 Minutes, updating viewers on what different characters were doing across different parts of the school at the exact same moment, exactly matching the visual style real fans of 24 already recognized from years of watching the actual drama unfold using that same technique. The episode also worked in the presence of moles hidden within different groups throughout the story, another direct reference to a common plot device found throughout 24, where hidden traitors working secretly against the main heroes often complicated already tense situations even further. Building the episode around all of these smaller structural details, split screens, a ticking countdown, hidden traitors, and a dedicated crisis unit working under enormous pressure allowed The Simpsons to borrow essentially the entire skeleton of 24, while filling that skeleton with material completely appropriate for an elementary school setting rather than a genuine national security crisis. This approach mirrored exactly the same strategy the writers had already used successfully with the Springfield Files, keeping the format and structure of The Real Show intact while replacing the actual stakes and danger with something far smaller and far sillier, letting the contrast between format and content carry most of the comedy. As the countdown inside the episode ticks closer toward the bake sale itself, tension builds through constant near misses and complications, exactly matching how a typical episode of 24 usually built toward its own climax. Rather than defusing an actual bomb capable of causing mass destruction, Bart and Lisa's entire mission comes down to successfully defusing the stink bomb before it can release its overwhelming smell across the school grounds, threatening to completely ruin the bake sale everyone had worked so hard to organize. The high point of the episode arrives once Bart and Lisa manage to successfully stop the bullies and defuse the stink bomb, technically succeeding in their overall mission despite the mismatched stakes running throughout the entire story. However, in a twist that added one final layer of comedy to the whole episode, the stink bomb still manages to go off regardless of their efforts, releasing its terrible smell across the bake sale anyway, despite Bart and Lisa's success in stopping the bullies themselves from directly causing the disaster on purpose. This particular twist worked as a sharp, subtle joke aimed directly at how 24 typically wrapped up its own storylines. Real episodes of the show often ended with the heroes technically succeeding at their mission, but usually paying some kind of steep personal cost along the way, sacrificing something important even in victory. Springfield's version captured that same bittersweet feeling on a much smaller scale, giving Bart and Lisa a technical win against the bullies while still allowing the actual disaster, the ruined bake sale, to happen anyway, almost as an afterthought, showing that even careful planning and teamwork could not fully control every outcome once chaos had already been set into motion. Beyond the main storyline involving Bart, Lisa, and the stink bomb, the episode included several smaller comedic touches that added extra flavor without pulling focus away from the central parody. At one point during the chaos, a menacing voice comes over the school's loudspeaker system, delivering an exaggerated, dramatic warning to the entire town, telling Springfield to prepare for destruction, a line clearly clearly written to mimic the kind of overly serious, dramatic dialogue commonly heard throughout tense moments on the real 24, delivering that same kind of dramatic warning over a school intercom system aimed at students eating lunch and preparing for a bake sale rather than facing any genuine citywide threat, highlighted once again just how far The Simpsons was willing to stretch the format of a serious action drama into something completely harmless and silly. The fallout from the entire episode plays out with relatively little lasting drama, matching the lighthearted tone established from the very beginning of the story. Unlike a typical season of 24, where major decisions often carried serious long-term consequences stretching across multiple episodes, Springfield's bake sale disaster resolves itself fairly quickly once the immediate chaos settles down, treating the entire event as a fun, self-contained story rather than something requiring any deeper exploration in future episodes. 24 Minutes received recognition beyond just entertaining fans watching at home. The episode won an Annie Award, one of the most respected prizes given specifically for excellence in animation, matching the same honor earned years earlier by the Springfield Files for its own successful crossover work with the X-Files. Earning that same specific award for two separate crossover episodes built around two completely different real shows showed just how consistently skilled The Simpsons had become at pulling off this exact type of parody, successfully blending outside material with its own established world without losing the comedic identity that made the show successful in the first place. What 24 Minutes left behind reaches beyond simply being a fun episode built around a clever crossover gimmick. The episode demonstrated once again just how flexible The Simpsons had become when it came to studying a real show closely enough to copy its exact structure, then filling that structure with material completely appropriate for Springfield's usual chaotic, low-stakes world. Rather than mocking 24 by exaggerating it into something unrecognizable, the writers stayed remarkably faithful to the real show's pacing, visual style, and dramatic tone, trusting that simply shrinking the stakes down to a school bake sale would create enough natural comedy on its own without needing much additional exaggeration. Bringing in Kiefer Sutherland and Mary Lynn Rajskub to voice their own established characters added the same kind of credibility and self-aware humor found earlier during the crossover with the X-Files, showing that real actors from popular dramas were willing to step into Springfield's world and poke fun at their own famous roles, provided the joke stayed clever and respectful enough toward the source material they had originally helped build. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's brush with a real ticking clock ends with nothing more serious than a ruined bake sale and a smell nobody wanted to deal with. But not every outside show Springfield borrowed from stayed focused on modern action or federal investigations. Somewhere deep in the show's own history, an entire summer once passed, with nobody in America able to answer one single burning question, a mystery built directly out of an old primetime drama that once had the whole country guessing who pulled the trigger. Section 6. The primetime soap cliffhanger, Dallas. An entire country once stopped what it was doing just to argue about who pulled a trigger inside a fictional office on a primetime soap opera. That mystery became one of the biggest television events of its time, and years later, one animated show decided to borrow that exact formula, aiming it at its own richest, cruelest character. This is the story of how The Simpsons built a mystery so big that fans spent an entire summer guessing, all while paying tribute to the primetime drama that started the whole trend in the first place. The Simpsons built its own version of this mystery across a two-part episode called Who Shot Mr. Burns, with Part 1 airing as the 25th and final episode of Season 6 on May 21st, 1995, and Part 2 returning as the very first episode of Season 7 on September 17th of that same year. Both episodes were written by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. This remains the only two-part episode structure of its kind across the entire history of The Simpsons, stretching a single storyline across an entire summer break between seasons rather than wrapping everything up within one single episode. The story behind Who Shot Mr. Burns began with Springfield Elementary School striking oil directly beneath the playground, giving the struggling school a sudden and unexpected source of money. Mr. Burns, already established across the series as greedy and cruel, quickly schemes to steal that oil for himself rather than letting the school keep its newfound fortune. His plan causes serious damage across several parts of Springfield, including the school itself, the retirement home, Moe's Tavern, and the Simpson family directly, making Mr. Burns even more hated around town than he already was before the oil ever appeared. By the end of Part 1, nearly everyone in Springfield Springfield has a real reason to want Mr. Burns gone for good. Groundskeeper Willie loses his job because of Burns and openly shouts that he plans to kill him, adding almost as an afterthought that he also intends to wound Smithers while he is at it. Homer gets dragged away by security after failing to spray paint his name across Burns's office in anger, muttering the entire time that Burns is a dead man walking. With so many Springfield residents holding a genuine grudge, the episode ends with Mr. Burns getting shot by an unknown attacker during a speech, leaving his fate completely unresolved as the screen cuts to black. This entire setup was built as a direct homage to a real event from television history. The story served as a comedic homage to the famous Season 3 finale of the primetime drama Dallas, an episode called A House Divided, where the character J.R. Ewing, played by actor Larry Hagman, gets shot at the very end of the episode. That real cliffhanger set off months of nationwide speculation about who might have pulled the trigger, with the actual answer not revealed until a November episode months later. That reveal ended up drawing more than 80 million viewers, the largest audience ever recorded for a television broadcast up to that point in history. The Simpsons copied this exact structure almost perfectly, setting up a wide list of Springfield characters who each had believable reasons to want Mr. Burns dead, then forcing an entire audience to wait through a long summer break without any answer. Just like the real Dallas mystery, the show leaned into building suspicion around several different suspects, giving viewers plenty of theories to chew on before Part 2 ever aired. Fox took the mystery even further by launching a website called Springfield, specifically built to give fans small clues about who might have shot Mr. Burns, making this one of the earliest attempts by any television show to interact directly with its audience online. That website reportedly received more than 500,000 hits, showing just how much genuine excitement had built up around solving the mystery. A contest tied to the mystery ran alongside the website, sponsored by a company called 1-800-COLLECT, a business that let people place collect calls at cheaper rates before cell phones became common. To even qualify for the contest, fans needed to have actually used that specific service over the summer, a requirement that narrowed down the pool of eligible participants considerably compared to a normal open contest. When Part 2 finally aired months later, the true shooter turned out to be baby Maggie Simpson, a reveal nobody had seriously guessed beforehand. According to Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, only one person correctly guessed Maggie as the shooter ahead of time, posting the correct answer on a Simpsons discussion forum on the very same day Part 1 originally aired. The writers reportedly wanted to track this person down and give them a special prize, but the specific email address used to make that post had already expired by the time the contest wrapped up, leaving Oakley still searching for that anonymous fan even years later, according to later commentary. Part 2 included its own small tributes back to Dallas as well, beyond just the basic shooting mystery itself. The opening of Part 2 shows Smithers dreaming that shooting Mr. Burns was only a dream, before that dream shifts again into an entirely different scenario involving undercover detectives on a 1960s racing circuit. This layered dream sequence directly referenced a real moment from Dallas, where an entire season of storylines, including an earlier attempted murder, ended up being explained away as nothing more than one character's dream, a twist that upset plenty of real Dallas fans at the time. A television special called Springfield's Most Wanted also aired around this same period, hosted by John Walsh, a real television personality known for hosting a program called America's Most Wanted. This special worked as a direct parody of Walsh's real show, built specifically to help fictional Springfield residents solve the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns, airing right before Part 2 finally revealed the answer. The two-part mystery left a lasting mark well beyond its original broadcast. Critics and fans continued referencing who shot Mr. Burns for years afterward, often ranking it among the most memorable moments in the entire history of the show, largely because of how boldly it borrowed and adapted a real, massive television event from over a decade earlier and made it feel completely at home inside Springfield's own chaotic world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's mystery wrapped up with a baby holding all the answers, closing one of the biggest jokes the show ever built around real television history. Not every outside show got the same two-part treatment though. Somewhere across town, an entire police unit is about to start chasing criminals through the strangest possible setting a procedural drama could ever imagine, one elevator at a time. Section 7. The Police Procedural Franchise, Law and Order. A single police drama once grew so large that it eventually spawned an entire family of spin-off shows, all sharing the same basic formula, all airing under the same recognizable name. That growth eventually became so extreme that even a cartoon family sitting on a couch found the whole thing worth mocking. This is the story of how The Simpsons took direct aim at the sprawling Law and Order franchise, inventing a spin-off so oddly specific that it doubled as a joke about spin-off culture itself. The joke appeared inside an episode called Helter Skelter, which first aired during season 13 of The Simpsons in 2002. The main plot of that episode followed the Simpson family after they got fired from a reality television show and returned home to their normal lives. Once back in their living room, the family settles in to watch television, and the program playing on their screen turns out to be a fictional show called Law and Order, Elevator Inspectors Unit. The title of this fictional program worked as a direct parody of a real television series called Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, commonly shortened by fans to simply SVU. That real show premiered on NBC on September 20th, 1999, created by a television producer named Dick Wolf, who had already built the original Law and Order series into one of the most respected police dramas on television. Special Victims Unit became the very first spin-off of that original show, following a fictional group of detectives working out of a New York City precinct, handling serious and sensitive criminal cases. The original Law and Order series itself had premiered years earlier, debuting in 1990, and it grew into one of the most influential police dramas in the entire history of American television. Its basic structure split every episode into two connected halves, with the first half following detectives investigating a crime, and the second half following lawyers taking that same case through a courtroom trial. This two-part structure became instantly recognizable to millions of viewers, turning Law and Order into a dependable, long-running staple of network television for decades. Once Special Victims Unit proved successful, the Law and Order name kept expanding well beyond just those two shows. Over the years, the franchise grew to include several additional spin-offs, each one carrying the same basic Law and Order branding while focusing on a slightly different angle of crime and law enforcement. Shows like Law and Order, Criminal Intent, and Law and Order, Trial by Jury joined the lineup, each adding another branch onto an already massive television family tree built entirely around the same basic concept of police work, followed by legal proceedings. By the time The Simpsons aired Helter Skelter in 2002, the Law and Order franchise had already grown large enough that audiences everywhere recognized just how many different versions of the same basic show had appeared on television within just a few short years. Fans of the real franchise often joked among themselves about how many different specialized police units the writers behind Law and Order seemed willing to invent, stretching the same basic formula into narrower and narrower slices of police work. The Simpsons took that exact joke and pushed it about as far as it could possibly go. Rather than inventing another spin-off focused on a genuinely serious area of crime, the way the real Special Victims Unit focused on sensitive criminal cases, the writers imagined a spin-off so narrow and so unnecessary that it became funny purely through its own specificity. An entire police unit dedicated exclusively to inspecting and patrolling elevators sounds almost too small and too strange to justify its own television show, and that exact absurdity became the entire punchline. Inside the brief scene shown during Helter Skelter, the fictional program follows the same basic look and feel real audiences already associated with the actual Law and Order franchise. The show uses similar dramatic music, similar pacing between scenes, and the same kind of overly serious dialogue real fans of Law and Order already recognized from years of watching the franchise handle far more dangerous and dramatic criminal cases. Placing that exact tone around something as mundane as elevator inspections created a strong contrast, letting the joke land almost entirely through mismatched seriousness rather than needing any additional exaggeration. Homer's reaction while watching the fictional show adds another small layer to the joke. Rather than getting excited or invested in the program the way he often does with other exaggerated forms of entertainment throughout the series, Homer simply groans while watching Law and Order, Elevator Inspectors Unit, suggesting that even a man known throughout the show for enjoying plenty of mindless television finds this particular spin-off a bit much to take seriously. That small reaction worked as a stand-in for how the Simpsons writers themselves apparently felt about the real franchise's constant expansion, using Homer's exhausted response as a quiet commentary on spin-off fatigue, setting in among audiences everywhere. The premise of the fictional show centers around a team of officers assigned specifically specifically to catching criminals who commit crimes inside elevators, an idea that sounds almost too narrow to support even a single episode, let alone an ongoing series stretching across multiple seasons the way real franchises like Law & Order managed to do. This detail mattered because it captured exactly the kind of joke The Simpsons built its parody around, taking a real, respected franchise known for tackling serious criminal cases and shrinking that same formula down into something almost comically small and pointless by comparison. By the time this particular joke aired, real spin-off culture across television had already become a common talking point among casual viewers and critics alike. Networks regularly took successful shows and split them into multiple related programs, hoping to capture even more of an audience already invested in familiar characters and formats. Law & Order stood as one of the clearest and most successful examples of this strategy, working exactly as intended, with each new spin-off pulling in millions of viewers of its own, proving that audiences were more than willing to watch several different versions of essentially the same basic show running side by side. The Simpsons used its own brief joke to gently question just how far that strategy could reasonably stretch before it started to feel excessive. Rather than mocking the real Special Victims Unit specifically for its subject matter or its writing, the joke focused entirely on the broader pattern of constant expansion across the entire franchise, suggesting that eventually, if left unchecked, even the most respected and successful franchise might end up producing a spin-off too small and too strange to justify its own existence. This kind of joke required very little setup or exaggeration to land successfully with audiences already familiar with the real Law & Order franchise. Simply showing a fictional title card reading Law & Order, Elevator Inspector's Unit, paired with Homer's tired reaction, told the entire joke almost instantly, without needing a full storyline built around the fictional show itself. The Simpsons often relied on this exact technique throughout its history, using brief background jokes rather than full-length parody episodes whenever a target could be effectively mocked through a single sharp visual or line of dialogue alone. What this particular joke left behind reaches beyond just poking fun at one single franchise, stretched a little too thin. It captured a much wider pattern happening across television as a whole during that era, where successful formulas kept getting sliced into smaller and smaller pieces in hopes of capturing every possible corner of a network's audience. By choosing something as oddly specific as elevator inspections, The Simpsons managed to comment on that entire trend using nothing more than a single made-up title and one exhausted reaction shot, proving once again that some of the show's sharpest jokes required almost no screen time at all to make their point clearly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's brush with police procedural culture wraps up quickly, tucked into just a few seconds of screen time inside a much larger episode. But not every genre The Simpsons took aim at involved crime and courtrooms. Somewhere on a different television screen entirely, a completely different kind of drama is about to catch Marge Simpson's attention, one built around wealthy women, dramatic arguments, and cameras following every single moment of their daily lives. Section 8. The Reality Housewives genre. The Real Housewives. A group of wealthy women arguing on camera turned into one of the most profitable ideas in the history of reality television, spreading from a single gated community in California into dozens of cities around the world. That kind of success practically guaranteed some kind of Springfield version eventually showing up on screen, and it did, delivered through Marge Simpson sitting on her couch waiting for Homer to come home from work. This is the story of how The Simpsons took aim at the Real Housewives franchise, using nothing more than a few seconds of background television to poke fun at an entire genre built on wealth, drama, and cameras that never seemed to stop rolling. The episode responsible for this joke was called Boy Meets Curl, and it aired as the 12th episode of season 21 on February 14, 2010. It was written by Rob Lazebnik and directed by Chuck Sheets. The main story followed Homer and Marge forming a mixed curling team together, with Agnes and Seymour Skinner, a team that ends up getting selected to compete in the 2010 Winter Olympics being held in Vancouver. While that main plot moves forward, a separate, smaller storyline follows Lisa as she becomes increasingly obsessed with collecting small pins shaped like Olympic mascots, an obsession that eventually spirals into something closer to desperation as the episode continues. Somewhere in the middle of all this Olympic chaos, Marge finds herself waiting at home for Homer to return from work, and while she waits, she turns on the television and watches a fictional program called The Real Housewives of Shelbyville. This show exists entirely within the world of The Simpsons as a parody built directly off a real television franchise, and it appears on screen for only only a short amount of time before the story shifts back to the main Olympic plotline running through the rest of the episode. The Real franchise being mocked here began with a show called The Real Housewives of Orange County, which first aired on the Bravo network on March 21, 2006. That original series followed a group of wealthy women living inside a gated community, focusing on their daily lives, friendships, arguments, and the general glamour surrounding their wealthy lifestyles. The show's creator, Scott Dunlop, originally built the concept around a single wealthy neighborhood in California, and the format proved so successful that Bravo quickly turned it into an ongoing franchise, launching additional versions of the same basic idea set in different cities across the country over the following years. By the time The Real Housewives of Shelbyville appeared inside The Simpsons in 2010, the Real Housewives franchise had already expanded well beyond its original Orange County setting. New versions had launched, centered around New York City and Atlanta in 2008, followed by New Jersey in 2009, giving the franchise several different cities and casts, all following the exact same basic formula of wealthy women living dramatic, camera-ready lives. This rapid expansion mirrored a pattern seen across plenty of other successful reality shows during that era, where a single hit format kept getting copied and reused across different cities, different casts, and different local flavors of the same basic wealthy drama. The fictional version created inside The Simpsons swapped out Orange County for Shelbyville, a rival town that appears throughout the series as a constant point of comparison and competition against Springfield itself. Shelbyville had already been established across many earlier episodes as a nearby town that Springfield residents loved to view with a mix of jealousy and disdain, often depicted as slightly wealthier, slightly more polished, or simply different enough from Springfield to create ongoing rivalry between the two towns. Choosing Shelbyville as the setting for this particular parody fit naturally into that already established relationship, letting the joke work on two levels at once, poking fun at the Real Housewives franchise while also leaning on an already familiar rivalry that longtime fans of the show already recognized. The scene itself keeps things brief, showing Marge simply watching the fictional program on her television screen while she waits around the house. The show does not receive a large amount of screen time or a full storyline built around it the way some other parodies across the series received. Instead, the joke works quickly and quietly, relying on audiences already familiar with the Real Housewives franchise to immediately recognize exactly what kind of program Marge happens to be watching, without needing much additional setup or explanation. This brief approach fit well within a larger pattern found throughout many of The Simpsons' quickest parody jokes, where a single visual reference or a short scene playing on a background television screen could deliver an entire joke without requiring a dedicated storyline. Just showing the title Real Housewives of Shelbyville, paired with a quick glimpse of dramatic, wealthy-sounding women arguing on screen, told viewers everything they needed to know almost instantly, especially given how widely recognized the Real franchise had already become by 2010. The Real Housewives of Shelbyville did not disappear from the world of The Simpsons after this single brief appearance. The fictional show returned again in a later episode called Lona Lisa, this time referenced through a handbag connected to the fictional program rather than through footage of the show itself playing on a television screen. This detail matters because it shows the writers treating the Real Housewives of Shelbyville as an established piece of the show's fictional media landscape, something that could be referenced again later on, rather than existing purely as a one-time joke tied to a single episode. Beyond Boy Meets Curl and Lona Lisa, the general concept of wealthy women living dramatic, camera-ready lives came up again in a different way through an episode called The Real Housewives of Fat Tony. That episode centered on Marge's older sister Selma falling in love with a local mobster character named Fat Tony, eventually leading to marriage between the two and creating real tension between Selma and Marge as a result. While that particular episode focused mainly on the Bouvier sisters and their complicated relationship with each other, the title itself borrowed the general Real Housewives naming style, connecting back once again to the same Real franchise originally mocked through Marge's brief moment watching television back in Boy Meets Curl. This pattern of returning to the same joke more than once across different episodes shows something important about how The Simpsons approached parody targets that carried real staying power in popular culture. Rather than treating the Real Housewives franchise as a single joke worth using only once, the writers clearly recognized that the Real franchise's continued growth and popularity across many different cities gave them plenty of room to keep referencing it in different ways across multiple episodes stretched across different seasons. The joke itself worked because of just how quickly audiences everywhere had come to recognize the basic formula behind any Real Housewives show, regardless of which specific city or cast happened to be featured in any individual season. Wealthy women, dramatic arguments, glamorous homes, constant cameras capturing every small conflict and turning it into entertainment for a national audience. By 2010, this formula had already repeated itself across several different American cities through the Real franchise, making it an easy and instantly recognizable target for The Simpsons to poke fun at using nothing more than a fictional town name and a brief glimpse of a television screen. Marge's role in this particular joke also carries its own small layer of meaning worth noticing. Throughout the series, Marge is often shown as the most grounded, responsible member of the Simpson family, someone who generally avoids the kind of over-the-top drama and excess that other characters, especially Homer, tend to embrace without much hesitation. Placing Marge specifically in the position of casually watching wealthy women argue on television, simply as a way to pass time while waiting for Homer, suggests a kind of universal appeal tied to this particular genre of reality television, since even a character established as sensible and down-to-earth finds herself watching this kind of program without any particular embarrassment or reluctance. That detail reflects something real about how widely reality television built around wealthy women arguing on camera had spread across ordinary households by the time this episode aired. Shows like the Real Housewives franchise did not stay confined to a small or niche audience. Instead, they became mainstream entertainment, watched casually by all kinds of viewers, regardless of whether those viewers considered themselves particularly interested in wealth, drama, or gossip as a general rule. Marge casually flipping on the Real Housewives of Shelbyville while waiting for her husband captures that same widespread casual appeal in miniature, using just a few seconds of screen time to comment on how deeply this particular kind of reality television had worked its way into everyday households across the country. What this joke left behind reaches beyond just a quick laugh tucked into a single Olympic-themed episode. It captured a real cultural moment where reality television, built around wealthy women, had grown large enough and familiar enough that even a brief, unlabeled glimpse of the format on a background television screen told an entire joke on its own, without needing any further explanation. The choice to return to the same basic idea again later through Lona Lisa and the Real Housewives of Fat Tony only reinforced just how much comedic material The Simpsons found inside a single, ever-expanding reality television franchise built around glamour, wealth, and constant conflict between wealthy women living just close enough together to keep the drama running indefinitely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's brush with wealthy reality drama wraps up quickly, tucked into just a handful of seconds inside a much bigger episode about curling and Olympic pins. But not every show Springfield borrowed from stayed confined to entertainment and glamour. Somewhere else in town, Kent Brockman is about to step in front of a camera once again, ready to turn an ordinary local story into something far bigger than it probably deserves to be. Section 9, the local news magazine show, Eye on Springfield, 60 Minutes, and Entertainment Tonight. Local news has a reputation for turning small-town stories into breaking headlines, stretching a minor event into something that sounds like the biggest thing to happen all year. The Simpsons built an entire character around that exact habit, giving Springfield its own overdramatic news anchor, then handing him several different programs designed to mock nearly every corner of the real news and entertainment media business. This is the story of Kent Brockman and the long list of real news and entertainment shows he was built to imitate. Kent Brockman first appeared on television inside the first season episode Krusty Gets Busted, which originally aired on April 29, 1990. That episode followed Krusty the Clown getting arrested for armed robbery at the Quick E-Mart, with Bart and Lisa eventually proving Krusty had been framed by his own sidekick, Sideshow Bob. Kent Brockman appears during the episode reporting on Krusty's arrest and covering details of Krusty's career and health history for viewers watching the news coverage unfold. This episode marked Brockman's first full appearance as a real character, though the episode's director, Brad Bird, designed his physical look and personality specifically for this role. Brockman's design and personality did not come from nowhere. Brad Bird modeled the character directly after Ted Koppel, a real television journalist widely known for hosting a serious nightly news program. Beyond Koppel, the character also drew on two real Los Angeles news anchors named Hal Fishman and Jerry Dunphy, both well-known figures in local California news broadcasting. Dunphy reportedly took pride in being one of the inspirations behind Brockman and would tell people directly that he considered himself the real-life version of the character. On top of these real anchors, the writers also pulled inspiration from Ted Baxter, a fictional news anchor played by actor Ted Knight on an older television show called The Mary Tyler Moore Show, a character already well known for being pompous and a little too pleased with himself on camera. Combining real anchors with an already established fictional television anchor gave Brockman a strong foundation before he ever delivered his first joke. Audiences already familiar with any of these real or fictional figures could recognize pieces of Brockman's personality immediately, even before understanding the deeper layers of parody built into every program he would eventually host throughout the series. Once Brockman became a regular fixture on the show, The Simpsons gave him an entire lineup of different television programs to host, each one built as a direct parody of a specific real news or entertainment format. Rather than mocking just one single real show, the writers used Brockman as a launching point to poke fun at several very different corners of the media industry all at once, spread across different fictional programs he hosted on Channel 6. The first and most consistent of these programs remained the standard weekday evening news broadcast, where Brockman delivered ordinary Springfield headlines with an exaggerated sense of seriousness, regardless of how small or silly the actual story happened to be. This basic evening news format gave the writers endless opportunities to poke fun at how real local news often stretched minor events into dramatic headline material, treating routine town happenings with the same urgency a real news anchor might reserve for a major national story. Beyond the standard evening broadcast, Brockman also hosted a program called Smartline, built as a direct parody of a real national news program called Nightline. The real Nightline built its reputation around serious, in-depth conversations covering major current events, often bringing in experts and public figures to discuss important topics late into the night. Smartline copied that same basic structure and tone, giving Brockman a platform to interview Springfield residents and public figures using the same overly serious approach real audiences already associated with genuine late-night news programs, even when the actual topics being discussed inside Springfield rarely deserved that level of seriousness. Brockman also hosted a program called Bite Back with Kent Brockman, built as a parody of a real program called Fight Back with David Horowitz. The real Fight Back focused on consumer advocacy, helping ordinary viewers deal with scams, faulty products, and other everyday consumer problems, hosted by a real television personality who built his career specifically around that kind of consumer protection reporting. Bite Back copied this exact premise, giving Brockman his own version of a consumer advocacy program built around helping Springfield residents deal with similarly small, everyday complaints, all handled with the same theatrical flair Brockman brought to every other program he hosted. Alongside these more serious programs, Brockman also hosted Eye on Springfield, an entertainment-focused program built as a direct parody of a real regional program called Eye on LA. The real Eye on LA focused on entertainment news, lifestyle stories, and general human interest pieces specific to the Los Angeles area, blending serious reporting with lighter, more casual entertainment coverage. Eye on Springfield followed that same basic format, mixing celebrity gossip, unusual local stories, and general entertainment coverage into a single program, often opening with Brockman standing near a lake, introducing himself and the show using the same simple greeting nearly every single time it appeared across different episodes. Vil used Ruz. Eye on Springfield became one of the most frequently used programs across the entire series, often used as a quick way to open an episode or introduce whatever unusual local story happened to be driving that particular episode's plot forward. Whenever Lisa or Homer did something newsworthy or unusually controversial, Eye on Springfield tended to be the program covering it, giving the writers a reliable structure they could return to again and again whenever an episode needed a quick, funny way to introduce its central story through the lens of exaggerated local news coverage. Beyond directly parodying Eye on LA, Ion Springfield also picked up traits associated with other real entertainment and news magazine programs. At times, the show leaned closer to a serious news magazine format similar to the real program 60 Minutes, a long-running and highly respected show known for its in-depth investigative journalism covering major national and international stories. At other times, Ion Springfield shifted toward lighter, more gossip-focused entertainment coverage, closer to real programs like Entertainment Tonight and Access Hollywood, both well known for covering celebrity news, red carpet events, and general Hollywood gossip rather than serious journalism. This flexibility gave Ion Springfield a wider range than most other fictional programs featured throughout the series, letting the writers shift its tone depending on whatever specific joke a given episode needed to land. Sometimes the program played its coverage completely straight, mimicking serious investigative journalism for comedic effect when applied to an obviously minor Springfield story. Other times, the program leaned fully into gossip and spectacle, treating a small-town scandal with the same breathless excitement a real celebrity gossip show might reserve for an actual Hollywood scandal. One especially memorable moment connected to Brockman's news career came from an entirely different episode called Deep Space Homer, which aired during the show's 5th season. During a segment covering a real-seeming space mission, Brockman appears on air and openly states his belief that the broadcast signal might have actually been taken over by a master race of giant space ants, seemingly bracing himself and the audience for a complete takeover by these fictional alien insects. Brockman closes this particular moment with a now famous line, welcoming these new overlords with open submission rather than any resistance at all. This single moment became one of the most widely referenced lines in the entire history of the show, often repeated by real people online for years afterward whenever discussing any situation involving a new dominant force taking control of something, used specifically as a joke about giving up resistance entirely rather than actually welcoming anything dangerous. That particular moment captured something important about Brockman as a character and about the larger joke built around him. Real news anchors are generally expected to remain calm, measured, and professional, no matter what kind of story they happen to be covering, especially during moments of genuine uncertainty or potential danger. Brockman, by contrast, frequently abandoned any pretense of calm professionalism the moment a story turned even slightly dramatic, jumping straight to wild conclusions and dramatic declarations without any real evidence supporting his claims. This tendency became one of the clearest ways The Simpsons poked fun at how real news coverage sometimes prioritized dramatic, attention-grabbing statements over careful, measured reporting, especially whenever a story touched on something unusual or unexplained. Brockman's tendency toward exaggeration extended into his personal commentary segment as well, called My 2 Cents, which appeared as part of his regular evening news broadcast. This segment gave Brockman a dedicated space to share his own personal opinions directly with viewers, stepping outside of straight news reporting entirely in order to offer commentary on whatever topic he felt strongly about at that particular moment. Real news programs occasionally include similar commentary segments, giving anchors or contributors a chance to share personal opinions separate from straight factual reporting. My 2 Cents copied that same basic structure, though Brockman's opinions frequently came across as pompous, self-important, or simply out of touch with how ordinary Springfield residents actually felt about whatever topic he happened to be discussing. Brockman also hosted game show programming at different points throughout the series, including a program called Springfield Squares, built as a direct parody of the real game show Hollywood Squares. The real Hollywood Squares combined trivia questions with celebrity panelists, creating a mix of game show competition and comedic celebrity banter that became hugely popular across decades of American television. Springfield Squares copied this same basic format, giving Brockman a chance to host a lighter, more comedic program completely separate from his usual straight news duties, showing just how many different corners of the television landscape the character had been built to cover across his many different hosting roles. Taken together, all of these different programs turned Kent Brockman into far more than just a single running joke about one specific news anchor. Instead, he became a walking collection of nearly every major television news and entertainment format that existed by the time The Simpsons started poking fun at them, stretching from serious nightly news broadcasts, to consumer advocacy programming, to celebrity gossip shows, to game show hosting duties, all filtered through the same overly dramatic, slightly self self-important personality built directly from real anchors like Ted Koppel, Hal Fishman, and Jerry Dunphy, alongside the fictional influence of Ted Baxter. This wide range mattered because it let The Simpsons comment on the entire media landscape surrounding local television rather than picking just one single real program to mock directly. Real local television stations across the country often followed a similar pattern to Brockman's own lineup, mixing straight news coverage with lighter entertainment programming, consumer advocacy segments, and the occasional game show, all broadcast from the same small local station, using many of the same on-air personalities across different programs throughout the day and week. By building an entire fictional television lineup around one single anchor, The Simpsons managed to poke fun at just how much a single small market news personality often ended up wearing, hosting several completely different types of programming under one roof, blending serious journalism with pure entertainment in ways that sometimes blurred the line between honest reporting and pure showmanship built purely to keep viewers watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's news coverage rarely stays quiet for long, always ready to turn the next small-town event into a dramatic headline worth breaking into regular programming. But cameras following ordinary people through their daily lives were not limited only to news broadcasts inside Springfield. Somewhere else across town, an entire family is about to sign up for a very different kind of television experience, one that strips away modern comfort entirely and drops ordinary people into a world built to look like it belongs in a history book rather than a modern American town. Section 10. The Reality Competition / Docu-Living Genre. The 1895 Challenge. A television trend once convinced networks that stripping modern families of electricity, plumbing, and every basic comfort made for great entertainment, as long as cameras kept rolling the entire time. That trend crossed the Atlantic and eventually made its way into Springfield, where an ordinary termite problem turned into a full-blown reality television experiment. This is the story of how The Simpsons took aim at historical reenactment reality shows, using its own family as unwilling test subjects thrown straight into the 1800s. The episode responsible for this parody was called Helter Shelter, and it aired as the 5th episode of Season 14 on December 1st, 2002. The story begins with Lisa receiving an autographed hockey stick from a Russian player during a game the family attends after Homer gets sent home from work with a mild head injury. That stick turns out to be carrying a swarm of termites, and once the bugs break loose inside the house, the damage becomes severe enough that the family needs to have their entire home fumigated, a process expected to take 6 months to fully clear out the infestation. Suddenly, without anywhere to live, the Simpsons run through several options trying to find somewhere temporary to stay, none of which work out. Marge flatly refuses to let the family stay at Moe's Tavern, pointing out that Maggie has already become drunk simply from breathing in the fumes inside the bar. With no other real solution available, Barney and Carl mention a reality show called The 1895 Challenge, which requires an entire family to live inside a Victorian-era house while following a lifestyle consistent with that specific year, giving up nearly every modern convenience the family would normally rely on. Homer feels reluctant about the whole idea at first, but eventually agrees to bring the family in to audition anyway, given how limited their other options have become. During the audition process, the show's creator, a producer named Mitch Hartwell, openly admits within the story that he did not actually invent the concept himself. Instead, he explains that he saw a similar show airing on Dutch television and simply changed the title before bringing the format to America. This small detail worked as a direct wink toward how many real reality television formats during this era were often borrowed or adapted from earlier European programs, rather than being entirely original ideas created from scratch by American producers. The real show being parodied through the 1895 Challenge was a British program called The 1900 House, which first aired in 1999. That real program placed a modern family inside a carefully preserved Victorian-era home located in London's East End, requiring them to live using only tools, technology, and daily habits appropriate for that specific historical period. Participants dealt with genuine hardships throughout filming, including using chamber pots instead of modern plumbing, heating their home with coal fires rather than electricity, and going without any electric lighting at all throughout their entire stay. The 1900 House became a notable example of a growing trend in reality television during that era, one built around stripping modern comforts away entirely and watching how ordinary people adapted, or failed to adapt, to a completely different standard of daily living. living. The Simpsons pushed that same format back several additional years, moving the setting from 1900 back to 1895, and used the change specifically to heighten the difficulty and general absurdity of the challenge facing the family. Rather than choosing a general Victorian family reasonably suited to handle old-fashioned living, the fictional show's producers specifically select The Simpsons after watching how badly Homer overreacts to even the smallest inconveniences during the audition process. One network executive watching the audition tape remarks that families who fall apart over nothing make perfect reality television, immediately explaining exactly why producers wanted a family as excitable and dramatic as The Simpsons rather than choosing someone naturally suited to handle hardship calmly. This particular detail mattered because it captured something real critics frequently pointed out about the entire genre of hardship-based reality television during this era. Producers rarely selected participants purely based on who might genuinely succeed at adapting to difficult, old-fashioned living conditions. Instead, shows like this tended to prioritize casting people likely to struggle, argue, and create dramatic conflict on camera, since genuine hardship and interpersonal tension kept audiences watching far more reliably than a family calmly and successfully adjusting to their new circumstances without much visible struggle at all. Once filming begins, the family initially struggles exactly the way producers had hoped, arguing constantly and clashing over the drastic changes forced onto their daily routine. Bart complains bitterly about losing access to his usual toys and video games, left instead with nothing but old-fashioned Mutt and Jeff comic books to keep himself entertained throughout the entire experience. These early struggles translate directly into strong ratings for the fictional show, since viewers watching from home apparently enjoy seeing the family suffer and bicker through unfamiliar hardship far more than they would enjoy watching a peaceful, successful adjustment. Eventually, Homer manages to rally the rest of the family, helping everyone shift their attitude and begin cooperating with each other, rather than constantly fighting against their new circumstances. Once the family starts adapting successfully and living a genuinely functional version of life in 1895, the show's ratings begin dropping sharply, since audiences apparently find a peaceful, well-adjusted family considerably less entertaining to watch than one still struggling and arguing constantly. This drop in ratings pushes the show's producers to intervene directly, actively working to make the family miserable again, purely to boost viewership back up. Rather than simply accepting a peaceful, successful outcome, the producers introduce a character named Squiggy, borrowed directly from an older, real television show called Laverne and Shirley, into the Simpsons' Victorian household, specifically to stir up new conflict. Squiggy even receives permission from the producers to use a taser, deliberately introducing extra chaos and disruption purely to generate more dramatic footage for the show, regardless of how that disruption might affect the actual family living through the experience. This detail carried real weight as a piece of commentary on reality television production in general. Rather than letting the format simply document whatever happened naturally, the producers inside Helter Skelter actively manipulate the situation, introducing outside elements purely to manufacture drama on demand whenever ratings started slipping. This matched a real criticism frequently leveled against actual reality television during this era, where producers were often accused of staging or encouraging conflict behind the scenes rather than simply capturing events as they naturally unfolded in front of the cameras. When even Squiggy's disruptive presence fails to sufficiently boost ratings, the producers escalate their interference even further, relocating the entire Victorian house onto a river and allowing it to float downstream, deliberately creating a much more dangerous and unstable situation for the family to deal with. Eventually, the house runs aground and completely falls apart, leaving the Simpsons stranded without any food or proper shelter at all. Rather than stepping in to help, the television crew filming the entire disaster refuses to offer any assistance, citing rules against interfering with the natural reality of the show, all while the crew members themselves eat gourmet meals in plain view of the starving family, even instructing each other to burn their leftovers rather than share any food with the people they were supposedly there to document, rather than actively endanger. This moment pushed the episode's commentary about the entire genre to its sharpest point. Real hardship-based reality shows generally justified their premise by claiming an interest in showing genuine, unscripted human experience, letting audiences witness real struggle and real adaptation without artificial interference. Helter Skelter directly mocked that justification by showing producers willing to actively endanger their subjects purely for better ratings, then hiding behind the same claim of authenticity and non-interference, specifically to avoid any responsibility for the harm their own manipulation population had caused in the first place. Stranded and desperate, the Simpsons eventually encounter an entire group of contestants who had previously appeared on other reality shows, all similarly abandoned or mistreated by their own respective productions. Banding together with this group of reality television veterans, the family fights back against the producers responsible for their situation, working collectively to find their way back to safety and, as one description of the episode's ending puts it, back toward quality scripted television instead. That closing detail worked as one final, direct jab at the entire genre being parodied throughout the episode. Rather than simply escaping their immediate danger, the family's stated goal upon returning to safety involves finding proper scripted programming instead, drawing a clear and deliberate contrast between carefully written, traditional television storytelling and the chaotic, manipulated, and occasionally dangerous world of unscripted reality programming the family had just barely survived. Smaller details scattered throughout the episode added extra layers of parody beyond the core storyline itself. The episode's title, Helter Skelter, directly referenced the title of a well-known song called Helter Skelter by the Beatles, adjusting the wording slightly to fit the housing-based storyline running throughout the episode. A pest control company shown fumigating the family's original home carries the name A Bug's Death, itself a direct parody referencing a real animated film from 1998 called A Bug's Life. These smaller touches showed that even while building its main satirical target around a specific genre of reality television, the writers still found room to layer in additional smaller jokes referencing completely unrelated pieces of pop culture along the way. What Helter Skelter left behind captures something specific about how reality television, built around historical hardship, operated during the early 2000s, a genre that positioned itself as educational and authentic while frequently relying on manufactured conflict and questionable production choices behind the scenes to keep audiences entertained. By placing its own family directly inside that exact format, then showing producers willing to introduce dangerous outside disruptions and abandon basic responsibility toward the people they filmed, The Simpsons built one of its sharpest arguments yet about how far entertainment value could end up outweighing genuine care for the real people appearing on screen. Across every one of these 10 targets, from a real rival cartoon family down to a Victorian house floating helplessly down a river, Springfield never once ran short of real television history worth pulling apart and holding up to the light. Every genre eventually found its way onto a screen inside that small, chaotic town, rebuilt just enough to reveal exactly what made the original worth watching, and exactly what made it worth laughing at. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.